Hello friends, my name is Sachin Malik and in this video we are going to learn about weak square. A weak square is a square in opponent's position that cannot be covered by a pawn. Let's talk about this square. Black cannot cover this square by a pawn. Black does not have a pawn on c file, so black cannot play c6 to cover this d5 square. And black has already moved his e5 pawn 2 steps. This e5 pawn cannot cover the d5 square, so we can say that d5 is a weak square. What about the f5 square? Is f5 square a weak square? And answer is no, because black can play pawn to g6 and black can cover the f5 square with a pawn. So f5 is not a weak square. What about c5 square? This c5 square is already protected by the d6 pawn. So c5 is also not a weak square. What about c6 square? Yes, c6 square cannot be covered by the b pawn or by the d pawn. So c6 is also a weak square. What about e6 square? e6 square is already covered by the f7 pawn, so e6 is not a weak square. With this simple definition, you can find out a weak square in opponent's position easily. Now let's put some pieces in this position. How do we take advantage of a weak square? It's very simple. We put our pieces in the weak square. Because if we put our knight in this d5 square, then our knight cannot be chased away from the black's pawn. So our knight will stay there for the rest of the game. We can play bishop cross b6. We can eliminate this knight which is covering this d5 square, and after black plays queen cross b6, we can play knight to d5, and this knight is super powerful. It is attacking a lot of important squares in opponent's position. And this d5 knight cannot be chased away from black's pawn or black's pieces. Black's bishop cannot attack our knight, and black does not have any pawn to chase away our knight from d5. So weak squares are occupied by our pieces. Let's look at one more example. Can you identify a weak square in black's position? Take a look at black's position. Let's talk about this square. This square cannot be covered by any of opponent's black pawn. So this square is a weak square. What about this square? b6 square. Black's pawn cannot cover b6 square, so b6 is also a weak square. So how do we take advantage of a weak square? We should simply occupy the weak square with one of our pieces. In this position, we can play knight to e3 and then jump the knight to the d5 square. Note that we don't want to play knight d5 right now, because black can play knight cross d5, and now we have to capture with one of our pawns, and now this weak square is not available for our pieces. We should occupy a weak square with our pieces, not the pawns. Because if we occupy a weak square with our pieces, then our pieces will be very powerful on that weak square. So let's go back. Instead of putting knight to d5 directly, we should first play knight e3, and let's say black player moves like queen to e6. Now we can play knight d5, because even if black captures our knight, we can replace one knight with our another knight. So we will have a strong piece on a weak square. Let's look at another example. Can you identify a weak square in opponent's position? Notice this d6 square. This d6 square cannot be covered by black's pawn, so it's a weak pawn, and we have a very nice way of taking advantage of this square. White can play pawn to e5, covering this pawn, and we are also attacking the black's bishop. So black plays bishop cross f3, rook cross f3, and our pawn is attacking the knight. So let's say knight goes to d7. Now we can play knight e4. Our knight can jump to d6, and our knight is occupying this weak square. Let's say black plays king e7. We can play knight to d6. And we have occupied a weak square by our piece. White has a better position because of d6 knight. Compare this d6 knight with the d7 knight. Our knight is super active and black's knight is not so active. So white has advantage in this position. Let's look at next example. Can you identify a weak square in opponent's position? Take a look at this square, c5 square. If we put our knight or any other piece on this square, then black cannot chase away our piece with pawn. Black cannot play b6 or d6 to cover this square. So it's a weak square. What about the c6 square? Yes, c6 is also a weak square because black cannot cover this square with one of his pawns. So c5 is a weak, c6 is a weak square. What are other weak squares? Other weak squares are a6, a5, and f6 square is also weak, h6 square is also weak, d6 square is also weak because these squares cannot be covered by opponent's pawn. But how do we take advantage of these squares? White played bishop to c5, exchanging this dark squared bishop, knight d7, and now white played bishop cross f8. Now notice that with the exchange of dark squared bishop, these squares have become more weak because there is no dark squared bishop to cover these weak squares. So in future we can exploit these weak squares also. But right now let's jump on c5 with our knight. We have occupied a weak square with our knight. Black played queen e5 and white played pawn to e4, opening the position. Black played d cross e4, white played bishop cross e4. After bishop cross e4 and rook cross e4, black played queen d5. Black wants to exchange our queens, but white played queen e3. We don't want to exchange the queens right now. Rook cross e4 and white recaptured with the knight. Queen e5, white plays rook c5, this time exploiting a weak square with the rook. Queen goes to g7 because queen has to guard this square also, otherwise knight will jump on f6. Here white played rook a5, this time using this weak a5 square with the rook. Now notice that not only these squares are weak, but these pawns are also weak. f7 pawn cannot be defended by any other pawn. c6 pawn cannot be defended by any other pawn. So these two pawns are also weak, and our strategy is to attack them. We are using weak squares to attack weak pawns. Now there is no way for black to defend this pawn. And now white will get material advantage. So that's how you exploit weak squares. Let me tell you one more point about weak squares. The significance of a weak square is more if the weak square is on the central square or near the central squares. In this case, d5 is a weak square, so we exploited it by putting our knight on d5. We played knight to d5 and exploited this weak square. In this example, we exploited d6 square, which is near the central squares. In this case, b6 square is also a weak square, but it is away from the central square. So the importance of a weak square is less if it is away from the central squares. D5 weak square is more important than the B6 weak square because D5 is in the center of the board. So if you put your piece on the center of the board, it will be more powerful. I hope the concept of weak square is clear to you. See you in the next video.